When people think of the classic Namco arcade games that swept the world in the 1980s, most tend to think of Pac-Man, with Galaga coming in at a close second. Both of these games absolutely revolutionized the arcade experience, with great visuals, addictive gameplay that never gets old, and simple control schemes that don't overwhelm the player while also being incredibly versatile in their gameplay. With the overwhelming success of the arcade version of Galaga, Namco saw an opportunity to port the game home, and ever since there's been a version of Galaga on nearly every generation of game console since the NES days. From the PlayStation 1 to the SG-1000, and from the MSX to the Atari 7800, Galaga is a game that rivals Doom in port count. This video will take a look at some of the weirder ports, with a few gems sprinkled in between. Now, if we're taking a look at ports of the game, it's probably wise to cover the game they're based on. Galaga, released to arcades in 1981, is a sequel to 1978's Galaxian and completely obsoletes it in every way. Galaga ditches the Space Invaders-esque format of having every enemy spawn on screen at game start, choosing to have enemy ships fly in from multiple sides of the screen, allowing you to clear the board before it even forms. There are a few different types of bugs: the boss Galaga, which dives down and occasionally can capture your ship, the red bug, which is apparently named a Goe, that simply flies down laterally, and the yellow bug, which is apparently named Zacko, which will fly down and loop around before coming back to the top of the stage. Every 3 to 4 stages, you'll be subjected to a challenging stage, which is basically a bonus stage. Your objective is to shoot every alien as they fly down. Doing so will reward in big bonus points and an ego boost, and if you don't do it, you're lame. After the 4th stage, the bugs will start to do a kamikaze attack as they fly in, meaning you need to be ready to avoid them as well as enemy fire. It's an incredibly challenging and rewarding game. Pro level play for this game is insane, and I'm nowhere near that level, but I'm not half bad at it. Galaga revolutionized the arcade shooter genre, and said revolution made Namco a lot of money. So they decided to license and port the game to every single platform ever made afterwards, and it all started with the NES, not including the MSX and SG-1000 versions that came first. I'm going to talk about those later. NES Galaga was the second port to hit the US after Atari made an attempt in 1986. It released in 1988 for the NES, obviously. It runs off of an improved version of the MSX game logic, which I swear I'm going to cover in a second. Said logic is also incredibly similar to the arcade logic. The enemy logic is very similar to the arcade counterpart, the biggest difference being that the kamikaze move is incredibly fast and it's very hard to counter. The graphics and sound have taken a bit of a hit, mostly the colors and sound effects. It's nowhere near close to game breaking. And a bit of the music is off. Here's a comparison. Overall, it's a perfectly solid port, performs well enough and plays fine. But this is nowhere near the best version of the game. It's got heavy flaws. Said flaws are the reason it's so baffling that companies still release the NES ROM when they're making their nostalgia bait mini arcades. The arcade version is fairly easy to license and is far superior in gameplay. The NES version is perfectly fine, but its original predecessor, the MSX, is absolutely nothing but passable if you squint. MSX Galaga was the first ever Galaga port released to home consoles, released in 1983. The MSX doesn't have amazing hardware in terms of power, and Galaga proved that tenfold. It's generous to say it runs at half the speed of the arcade version, and while you might think that's a good thing, it's not. Galaga's fluid gameplay relies heavily on it running at the proper speed, and as soon as it doesn't, the mechanics fall apart completely, leading to easy frustration and garbage gameplay. The graphics are incredibly bad, however you need to keep in mind this is the MSX. Graphics were absolutely not the forte of the hardware, especially with early games like this. The sound is also a bit meh, however you need to keep in mind once again this is the MSX, it's not known for sound. Here's a comparison with the arcade version. When you look at this game from the time period it was released and limitations, it's a perfectly fine port. However, it is absolutely nowhere near optimal nowadays. But you have to give it credit for trying to follow the arcade formula and patterns, which is a lot more than you can say for Galaga on the Sega Game 1000. What do I even say about this game? Released around the same time as MSX Galaga, the SG-1000 port is as loose of an interpretation of Galaga as you can get. 2 enemy patterns that loop endlessly, no bonus stages, incredibly boring gameplay, and they couldn't even get the damn sound right. The SG-1000 port of Galaga is a curious oddity. It has no play value and is somehow fun. It is a complete guess as to how Galaga should look and feel, and is by far the most out there of a port you can get. Followed closely by Galaga on the Atari 7800, of course. Ah, the 7800. The Atari console that is known for nothing else other than releasing in 1986. Galaga was actually a launch title for the console, and I'm honestly shocked they tried to rush it out as hard as they did. It's a pretty piss port, all things considered. Enemy movement is completely slow and erratic, the screen ratio is completely messed up, and despite using the arcade patterns, any arcade memorization you have needs to be thrown out the window when playing this game. The weird-ass backward enemy movement completely ruins the gameplay. The boss Galaga normally moves with a smooth curve and then dives down at a slight diagonal angle, but in 7800 it judders around and then moves at a massive diagonal, which you are never able to accurately predict and counter. The graphics are equivalent to someone playing the arcade version and forgetting to wear their contact lenses. It's a rough amalgamation of the arcade graphics that are only accurate if you squint. They even fucked up the sound timing for the opening jingle. Overall, Atari held to their brand and released a terrible port of a classic game on a console most don't even remember. The 78 port has zero reason to exist, and yet it does anyway. Maybe it was a punishment for humanity's sin. Probably not. On a completely unrelated note, Game Boy. There was a combo cart released in 1995 for the original Game Boy, which bundled new ports of Galaga and Galaxian together for a shockingly great experience all around. The game had Super Game Boy enhanced colors and borders, which you're seeing right now, and honestly did a pretty good job representing the visuals, gameplay, and audio. I'd say the gameplay is a bit better than NES Galaga, but is worse in terms of colors. The Game Boy still only has 4 colors, even with the Super Game Boy, so they had to sacrifice for this port. The biggest problem with the chosen color palette is that the default color for the boss Galagas is blue, which is going to mess you up hard when you play this game. In the arcade version, a blue Galaga is a Galaga that's been hit once, out of 2 times, so you'll end up messing up if you're as used to the arcade version as I am, accidentally shoot it once and die. The gameplay is very solid, but the sound's a bit high-pitched. Overall, the Game Boy port of Galaga is a shockingly great version of the game, and is probably the best you can get in terms of Galaga on the go at the time. Galaxian is perfectly fine as well. I'm gonna cheat a bit, as I'd be doing you all a bit dirty if I didn't at least mention a Namco Museum game. For this video, I decided to take a look at Volume 1 on the PlayStation 1, and while I was expecting a gimped experience overall, I was shocked to see a near arcade perfect port. Namco Museum PlayStation 1's version of Galaga does the game justice in terms of graphics and gameplay, being the closest any port so far has gotten to the arcade. It's very hard to tell much of a difference when playing it until you listen to the audio. They used a mix of strangely low-quality captures from the arcade and replications of some arcade jingles that sound just that little bit off. It is absolutely nowhere close to being game-breaking, however you can very easily tell that the sound is off. Here's a comparison. Overall, for 1995, the PlayStation 1 Namco Museum port is incredibly impressive. It got what it needed to get right, and is overall an impressively close port to arcade. The only grievance I have is that it places the score to the side, which a lot of ports so far has done. This wouldn't be a problem if most people didn't use the score to center their ship for bonus stages. Who's up for a forgotten game streaming service? Launched in 2005, GameTap was a service meant to be a first-of-its-kind broadband gaming network where you could stream and play old games on multiple devices. Of course, Galaga was included here alongside other classics like Sonic 1, Earthworm Jim, Crazy Taxi, Pitfall, etc. Unfortunately, it was a streaming service launched in 2005, peak I want to actually own things era, and thus... what the hell, it lasted 5 years? Yeah, GameTap shockingly didn't die out instantly like I initially thought, instead somehow managing to claw into life for 5 years. But that's off topic, and back on the topic of Galaga, the GameTap version appears to have just been the arcade version, so there really isn't much interesting to talk about there. Galaga is a video game that will never be forgotten, remaining in the public limelight for 40 years and counting. It is still getting new ports to this day, including the amazing Namco Museum on Switch and the great Arcade Classic Series ports on modern PlayStation, Xbox consoles, and even PC. There are loads of ports I didn't cover here, because most ports after the PlayStation 1 days are incredibly close to, if not arcade perfect, and therefore there's not much I could say. On this video, I wanted to take a look at the more obscure and weird ports this game has gotten over the years. That's all I have to say here, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.